The scorching Arizona sun beat down on Bethany Evans as she rode her chestnut mare through the rugged desert landscape, the weight of her father's legacy hanging heavy on her shoulders. It was 1878, and at 22 years old, she had inherited both his ranch and his debts following his sudden passing 3 months prior. The banker in Quartzsite had given her until the end of summer to come up with the money, and her only hope lay in the small herd of cattle she was driving to the railhead in Tuxen. "Come on, Maple," Bethany urged her horse forward, adjusting her wide-brimmed hat to shield her eyes from the relentless sun. Her blonde hair was tied back in a practical braid, and her skin had bronzed from weeks spent working the ranch alone. The 10 head of cattle she managed to salvage from her father's once prosperous herd plodded ahead of her, driven by her careful guidance. The trail stretched before her, winding through cactus-studded terrain and rocky outcroppings. She'd been on the move since dawn, determined to reach the water hole her father had marked on his old, weathered map before nightfall. Her canteen was running dangerously low, and both she and the animals needed rest. As the afternoon wore on, Bethany spotted a familiar landmark, a formation of red rocks that resembled a sleeping giant. Relief washed over her as she consulted her father's map once more. The water hole should be just beyond the next ridge, nestled in a small canyon that provided shade and shelter. "Almost there," she whispered to herself, urging the cattle forward. What Bethany didn't notice was the pair of eyes watching her from atop the ridge. Griffin Quinn had been trailing the same path, his own small herd of horses destined for sale in Tuxen. At 30 years old, he'd spent most of his adult life as a ranch hand and horsebreaker, slowly building his own modest enterprise. His dark hair curled beneath his hat, and his tanned face was weathered from years under the western sun. Griffin observed the young woman with curiosity. It was unusual to see a lone female driving cattle through such treacherous territory. Something about her determined posture and the capable way she handled the cattle told him she wasn't some greenhorn, despite her youth. As Bethany disappeared over the ridge toward the waterhole, Griffin clicked his tongue, encouraging his horses to follow. He'd wait his turn at the watering hole. It was only proper. The canyon opened before Bethany, revealing a small, tree-shaded pool fed by a spring trickling from the rocks. The sight of water made her throat feel even drier than before. She guided the cattle to one end of the pool and dismounted, leading Maple to the opposite side to drink. Kneeling beside the clear water, Bethany splashed her face and refilled her canteen. The coolness against her skin was heavenly, and for a moment she closed her eyes in relief. That's when she heard it, the unmistakable warning rattle. Time seemed to slow as Bethany's eyes snapped open. No more than 3 feet away, coiled and ready to strike, was a diamondback rattlesnake, its distinctive pattern stark against the sandy ground. Her muscles tensed, and she tried to ease backward, but her sudden movement only agitated the creature further. With horrifying speed, the snake struck, its fangs sinking into her calf just above her boot. Bethany cried out, more in shock than pain at first, stumbling backward and falling onto the rocky ground. The commotion spooked the cattle, causing them to scatter up the canyon walls. Maple whinnied in alarm, pulling back on her reins, which were loosely wrapped around a nearby tree branch. Griffin heard the scream and immediately kicked his horse into a gallop, leaving his herd behind as he raced toward the sound. When he crested the ridge and saw the woman on the ground, clutching her leg, he knew exactly what had happened. He leaped from his horse while it was still moving, landing hard and running to her side. The rattlesnake had already retreated to the safety of a nearby rock pile. "Don't move," Griffin commanded, kneeling beside her. "Where'd it get you?" Bethany's face had gone pale, her blue eyes wide with fear. "My calf," she managed, pointing to the already swelling puncture wounds. Without hesitation, Griffin pulled his knife from its sheath. "This is going to hurt, but I need to cut it a bit to get the venom out." Bethany nodded, gritting her teeth as he made a small, precise incision across the puncture wounds. Blood mixed with the clear venom oozed from the cut. "Hold still now," Griffin said, his voice steady despite the urgency of the situation. He bent down and pressed his mouth to the wound, sucking out the poisoned blood and spitting it onto the ground. Bethany watched him through a haze of pain and growing nausea, her breath coming in short gasps. "My cattle," she murmured. "I can't lose them." Griffin spat once more and looked up at her. "Your cattle are the least of your worries right now, miss. That venom's already spreading." He repeated the process several more times before sitting back on his heels. "What's your name?" he asked, reaching for his canteen. "Bethany Evans," she replied, her voice weak. "And you, Griffin Quinn." He handed her his canteen. "Drink this. We need to keep you hydrated." The pain was intensifying, a burning sensation that radiated from her calf through her entire leg. "Thank you, Mr. Quinn," she whispered before another wave of pain made her wince. "Call me Griffin," he said, quickly gathering materials to make a fire. "I'm going to make camp right here. You shouldn't be moved too much right now." Bethany tried to protest, but the venom was taking its toll. Her vision swam, and she felt increasingly lightheaded. "The cattle," she repeated weakly. "I'll round them up after I get you settled," Griffin promised, already pulling blankets from his saddlebags. He laid them out in the shade of a large boulder and gently lifted Bethany onto this makeshift bed. "Rest now. I'll take care of everything." As consciousness began to slip away from her, Bethany's last thought was that her father would have appreciated a man like Griffin Quinn, direct, capable, and unflinchingly brave. Griffin worked quickly, building a small fire and setting water to boil. He'd seen rattlesnake bites before some victims survived. Others didn't. It all depended on how much venom was injected, how quickly it was addressed, and the person's own constitution. Looking at Bethany's flushed face, he knew she was already developing a fever. He used a bandana soaked in cool water to wipe her brow, then set about gathering her scattered cattle. It took nearly an hour to round them all up again, but he managed to get them corralled in a natural enclosure formed by the canyon walls, blocking the exit with deadfall brush. Night fell quickly in the desert, the temperature dropping as dramatically as the sun. Griffin kept the fire well fed, periodically checking on Bethany. Her breathing had grown shallow and her skin burned with fever. He elevated her bitten leg on his rolled-up jacket and continued to cool her face and neck with damp cloths. "Don't you die on me, Bethany Evans," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "You're too stubborn to let a snake get the better of you." Around midnight, Bethany stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Water," she croaked, her voice barely audible. Griffin lifted her head gently, helping her sip from his canteen. "That's it," he encouraged. Small sips, her eyes, though glazed with fever, focused on his face. "You stayed," she said, sounding surprised. "Of course I stayed. What kind of man would I be if I left you out here alone?" Griffin replied, setting the canteen aside. "My cattle?" she asked. "All accounted for and watered," he assured her. "Your horse, too." Bethany tried to sit up but immediately fell back with a groan. "I need to get to Tuxen." "The bank, Tuxen isn't going anywhere," Griffin interrupted. "And neither are you for at least a few days." She wanted to argue but lacked the strength. Instead, she whispered, "Thank you," before drifting back into a restless sleep. Griffin watched her for a long moment, struck by her determination even in such a dire situation. Most people would be thinking only of survival, yet here she was, worried about cattle and banks. There was clearly more to Bethany Evans than met the eye. He settled back against a rock, his rifle across his lap, preparing for a long night of vigilance. The next morning, Bethany awoke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Griffin moving around the campsite. Her leg throbbed painfully, but her head felt clearer. The fever had broken sometime during the night. "Morning," Griffin said, noticing her awake. He poured a cup of coffee and brought it to her. "Think you can sit up?" Bethany nodded, allowing him to help her into a sitting position, her back propped against the boulder. The movement sent fresh waves of pain through her leg, but she clenched her jaw and accepted the coffee with a grateful smile. "How bad is it?" she asked, nodding toward her leg. Griffin knelt beside her and carefully unwrapped the bandage he'd applied the night before. The area around the bite was swollen and discolored, but not as badly as he'd feared. "Could be worse," he said honestly. "The fact that you're coherent and the swelling hasn't spread past your knee is a good sign, but you're not riding anywhere anytime soon." Bethany sighed, frustration evident in her expression. "I don't have time to be laid up, Mr. Quinn." "Griffin," he corrected. "And time isn't something you can negotiate with, especially when it comes to healing." She took a sip of coffee, wincing at both its strength and the truth of his words. "I've got 10 head of cattle that need to get to Tuxen by next week, or I lose everything." Griffin sat back on his heels, studying her. "Your father's ranch." Bethany's surprise must have shown on her face because Griffin smiled slightly. "It's not hard to figure. Young woman alone with cattle, desperate to make a deadline. It's usually either an inheritance or a husband gone bad." "My father," she confirmed. "Jacob Evans. He died 3 months ago, left the Double E Ranch to me along with a mountain of debt I didn't know existed." Griffin nodded. "I knew of your father. Good man, fair dealer. I bought a horse from him 2 years back." "You did?" For some reason, this connection pleased Bethany more than it should have. "Which one?" Chestnut, gelding with a white blaze, called him Thunder. Bethany smiled for the first time since the snake bite. "I remember that horse. Nearly broke my arm when I was helping to train him. How is he?" "Best horse I ever owned," Griffin said, returning her smile. "Still have him, in fact. He's with my herd up on the ridge." The conversation drifted into comfortable silence as they both sipped their coffee. Finally, Griffin spoke again. "I'm heading to Tuxen myself. Got a small herd of horses to sell. I could drive your cattle alongside mine." Bethany stared at him, searching for the catch. "Why would you do that for me?" Griffin shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Consider it repaying your father for selling me a fine horse at a fair price." She knew there had to be more to it than that, but she was in no position to refuse the offer. "I can't pay you much," she warned. "We can discuss payment later," Griffin said, standing up. "For now, let's focus on getting you well enough to travel. It'll be slow going with you injured, but if we take it steady, we should make it to Tuxen in time." Bethany wanted to protest that she didn't need his charity, that she could manage on her own once the swelling went down. But the reality of her situation was undeniable. Without Griffin Quinn's help, she would lose everything her father had worked for. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "I won't forget this." Griffin simply nodded, turning away to tend to the horses. But not before Bethany caught a glimpse of something in his eyes, something that made her heart beat a little faster despite her weakened condition. For the next 3 days, they remained camped by the water hole. Griffin constructed a more substantial shelter for Bethany using branches and his oilcloth, protecting her from both the harsh sun and the occasional desert shower. He hunted for fresh meat, prepared simple but nourishing meals, and twice daily cleaned and redressed her wound. Bethany, for her part, fought against being completely useless. She insisted on taking over cooking once she could sit up comfortably, and she kept track of the cattle from her resting spot, calling out if any strayed too far from the water. During the long hours of enforced idleness, they talked. Bethany learned that Griffin had been orphaned young and raised by his uncle on a small ranch in Texas. He'd left at 18 to make his own way, working as a ranch hand, horsebreaker, and occasionally as a scout for the army. 3 years ago, he'd saved enough to buy his own small spread near Prescott, where he bred and trained horses. In turn, she told him about growing up as an only child on the Double E, learning ranching from her father after her mother died of influenza when Bethany was just 12. She spoke of her father's dream to expand the ranch, how he'd taken risks that ultimately didn't pay off, and how determined she was to save what remained. He always said a ranch isn't just land and cattle, Bethany explained on the third evening as they sat by the fire. It's a legacy, a piece of yourself you leave behind. Griffin nodded, poking at the embers. My uncle said something similar, called it putting down roots so deep that the strongest wind couldn't uproot you. Exactly, Bethany said, smiling at how perfectly that captured the feeling. That's why I can't lose it. It's all I have left of him. Griffin looked up at her, the firelight casting shadows across his face. You'll keep it, he said with quiet conviction. We'll get your cattle to market and you'll pay that banker. The way he said, we made Bethany's chest tighten with an unexpected warmth. She'd spent the past 3 months feeling utterly alone, shouldering her father's debts and responsibilities without anyone to lean on. Having Griffin beside her, even temporarily, eased that burden in ways she hadn't realized she needed. On the 4th morning, Bethany tested her injured leg, finding that while it was still painful, she could put weight on it briefly. I think I can travel today, she announced as Griffin returned to camp with fresh water. He frowned, setting down the water bucket. It's too soon. The swelling's barely gone down. We've already lost too much time, Bethany insisted. I can ride, slowly, but I can manage. Griffin studied her determined expression and sighed. Stubborn woman, he muttered, but there was a grudging respect in his tone. We'll try for a few hours today. At the first sign you're pushing too hard, we stop. Agreed, Bethany nodded, relieved he wasn't going to fight her on this. Agreed. It took longer than usual to break camp, with Griffin doing most of the work while Bethany supervised from her seated position. Finally, with everything packed and the animals gathered, Griffin helped her mount Maple. How does it feel? He asked, standing beside her horse, his hand still on her arm. Bethany shifted in the saddle, adjusting her injured leg. The pain flared but remained bearable. I'll manage, she assured him. Griffin didn't look convinced but mounted his own horse, a sturdy black gelding he called Shadow. We'll take it slow, he reminded her. Follow the creek bed south. It's a longer route but easier traveling. They set off at a gentle pace, Griffin leading his horse herd while Bethany's cattle followed behind, occasionally needing to be urged forward by Griffin circling back. The desert landscape slowly changed as they traveled, the rocky terrain giving way to more vegetation as they followed the seasonal creek. By midday, Bethany was fighting to stay upright in the saddle. The constant movement had aggravated her wound, and beads of sweat stood out on her forehead despite the relatively mild temperature. Griffin noticed immediately. We're stopping, he declared, guiding them toward a stand of cottonwood trees that offered ample shade. Too exhausted to argue, Bethany allowed him to help her dismount and settle on a blanket spread in the shade. He examined her leg, his expression grim when he saw that the area around the wound had reddened again. This was too much, too soon, he said, his voice tinged with self-reproach. We should have waited another day. We don't have another day, Bethany reminded him weakly. Griffin shook his head. No use getting to Tuxen if you lose the leg or worse. The stark reality of his words silenced her protests. Rattlesnake bites could indeed be fatal, or lead to amputations if infection set in. She'd been lucky so far, but pushing her luck wasn't wise. One more day of rest, Griffin decided. Then we'll try again, but with a different approach. That different approach became clear the next morning when Griffin returned to their camp after an early scouting expedition. He'd found an abandoned wagon about 2 miles south, likely left behind by travelers who had to lighten their load to cross the rougher terrain. "The axle and wheels are still good," he reported. "I can rig it up with some of the canvas from my supplies, make a kind of bed for you to lie on. It'll be a rough ride, but better than you being in the saddle." Bethany considered this. "Who will drive it?" "I will. We'll tie your mare to the back, and I'll lead my horse herd ahead. The cattle can follow behind." It wasn't ideal. One man managing horses, cattle, and a wagon was a tall order, but it was their best option. It took Griffin most of the day to retrieve the wagon and repair it enough for their purposes. By late afternoon, he had created a surprisingly comfortable bed in the wagon bed, using his bedroll and Bethany's for padding and rigging a canvas cover to provide shade. They set out again the following morning. Bethany settled in the wagon, her injured leg elevated on a makeshift pillow while Griffin took the reins. True to his word, the ride was rough, every bump sending jolts of pain through her leg, but it was manageable. Their progress was slow but steady. Griffin proved remarkably adept at managing both his horses and her cattle, keeping the animals moving in the right direction while navigating the increasingly visible trail toward Tuxen. At night, they made camp early, allowing Bethany time to rest her leg and Griffin time to secure the animals. Their evening conversations continued, growing deeper as days passed. Bethany found herself sharing thoughts and feelings she'd never voiced to anyone, not even her father. "I'm afraid," she admitted one night, a week into their journey. "Not just of losing the ranch, but of failing him. Of not being good enough to carry on what he built." Griffin, who had been cleaning his saddle nearby, set it aside and moved closer to her. "Your father would be proud of you, Bethany. Not many would have the courage to do what you're doing." She shook her head. "It's not courage. It's desperation. Sometimes they're the same thing." He reached out and, after a moment's hesitation, covered her hand with his. "And for what it's worth, I think you're more than good enough." The simple touch sent warmth spreading up her arm, and she found herself turning her hand to lace her fingers with his. It was a small gesture, but felt monumental in the quiet of the desert night. They sat that way for several long moments, neither speaking, the connection between them growing stronger than words could express. Finally, Griffin gently squeezed her hand before releasing it. "Get some rest," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We've got a long day tomorrow." As Bethany settled back in her bedroll, she realized that somewhere along this journey, her feelings toward Griffin Quinn had transformed from gratitude to something much more complex and powerful. The next morning brought a new challenge. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and the air felt heavy with impending rain. "Flash floods are common in these parts," Griffin warned as he helped Bethany into the wagon. "If it starts to pour, we'll need to get to higher ground fast." They traveled more quickly that day, Griffin pushing the animals harder than before, trying to reach a more protected area before the storm hit. By mid-afternoon, the first fat raindrops began to fall, quickly turning into a steady downpour. Griffin guided the wagon toward a rocky outcropping that rose above the surrounding terrain. "We need to get up there," he shouted over the increasing roar of the rain. The climb was treacherous, the wagon wheels slipping in the rapidly muddying ground. Bethany clutched the sides of the wagon, her heart pounding as they narrowly avoided sliding backward several times. Lightning cracked overhead, spooking the horses. Griffin fought to control them, his shirt plastered to his body by the rain, his hat pulled low against the deluge. "Almost there," he called to Bethany, guiding the team around a particularly steep section. Just as they reached the relative safety of the outcropping, a tremendous boom of thunder sent the lead horse rearing in panic. The wagon lurched sideways, tipping precariously. Bethany screamed as she felt herself sliding toward the edge. Griffin released the reins and lunged for her, catching her around the waist just as the wagon tilted further. In one powerful movement, he pulled her from the wagon and against his chest, stumbling backward onto solid ground as the wagon crashed onto its side. They landed hard, Griffin taking the brunt of the impact with Bethany sprawled atop him. For a moment they lay there, breathless and stunned, rain pelting down around them. Then Griffin's arms tightened around her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice urgent. Bethany took mental stock of her body. Her leg throbbed, but no worse than before. "I'm all right," she managed. "You?" "Nothing broken," he assured her, though she felt him wince as he shifted beneath her. It was then that Bethany became acutely aware of their position, her body pressed intimately against his arms still wrapped protectively around her waist. Their faces were inches apart, rain streaming down their cheeks like tears. Something changed in Griffin's expression as he seemed to realize the same thing. His gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, a question in them that made Bethany's breath catch. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Griffin raised one hand to cup her cheek. "Bethany," he whispered, her name almost lost in the sound of the rain. She answered by closing the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that started tentatively, but quickly deepened as months of loneliness and days of growing attraction culminated in this moment. Griffin's hand moved to the back of her head, holding her to him as he returned the kiss with equal fervor. The world narrowed to just the two of them, the feel of his lips on hers, the strength of his arms around her, the shared warmth of their bodies against the cool rain. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Griffin rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for days," he confessed. Bethany smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in months despite their precarious situation. "I'm glad you finally did." The moment was broken by a panicked whinny from one of the horses. Reality crashed back as Griffin helped Bethany to her feet, keeping her weight off her injured leg. "The animals," she said, looking around anxiously. "They've sought shelter on their own." Griffin pointed to where both cattle and horses had huddled under an overhang of rock nearby. "Smart beasts. Now let's get you out of this rain." He found a small cave-like depression in the rock face, just large enough for the two of them to squeeze inside. It was dry and offered protection from the wind that had begun to howl across the desert. Griffin spread out their damp bedrolls as best he could, then helped Bethany settle against the back wall of their shelter. "Your leg?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "Sore, but no worse for the adventure," she assured him. He nodded, relieved, then sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. Outside, the storm continued to rage, lightning illuminating the landscape in brief, brilliant flashes. "The wagon?" Bethany asked after a while. Griffin shrugged. "Tipped over but likely salvageable. We'll check it when the storm passes." Bethany leaned her head against his shoulder, suddenly exhausted by the day's events. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for today, but for everything. I'd be dead if not for you." Griffin slipped his arm around her shoulders, drawing her closer. "I think fate put us on the same trail for a reason, Bethany Evans." She looked up at him, studying the strong line of his jaw, the gentleness in his eyes that belied his rough exterior. "What reason might that be?" Instead of answering with words, Griffin lowered his head and kissed her again, more gently this time but with no less emotion. Bethany responded eagerly, her hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling his heart pound beneath her palm. When they separated, Griffin tucked a strand of damp hair behind her ear. "I've spent most of my life wandering," he said quietly, "never staying in one place too long, never letting myself get too attached to anyone or anything." "And now," Bethany prompted when he fell silent, "now I'm thinking maybe it's time to put down those roots my uncle talked about." His eyes held hers, vulnerable yet determined. "If I found the right place, the right person—" Bethany's heart soared at his words even as caution held her back. "Griffin, we've known each other barely 2 weeks." "Sometimes 2 weeks is enough to know what matters," he countered. "I'm not saying we have all the answers, Bethany, just that I'd like the chance to find them, with you." The sincerity in his voice broke through her last defenses. "I'd like that too," she admitted, leaning into his embrace. They spent the night in their small shelter, talking softly as the storm gradually subsided. Griffin shared more about his wandering years, the loneliness that had become so familiar he hardly noticed it anymore until Bethany made him feel its absence. Bethany spoke of her fears for the future, her determination to honor her father's memory, and her growing feelings for the man who had saved her life in more ways than one. Dawn broke clear and bright, the desert washed clean by the night's storm. Griffin left Bethany resting while he assessed the damage to the wagon and checked on the animals. All had survived the night, though the cattle were restless after the storm. The wagon had fared reasonably well, a broken wheel that Griffin managed to repair with materials from his saddlebags and some creative engineering. By mid-morning, they were ready to continue their journey. "We should reach Tuxen by tomorrow evening," Griffin estimated as he helped Bethany back into the repaired wagon. "Just in time to make your appointment with the bank." Bethany nodded, though her thoughts were more on what would happen after that appointment. Would Griffin truly stay as he'd suggested during the night? Or would the reality of town life send him back to his wandering ways? As if reading her thoughts, Griffin paused before climbing onto the wagon seat. "I meant what I said last night," he assured her. "All of it." Relief flooded through her. "I'm glad," she said simply. The final day and a half of their journey passed without further incident. Bethany's leg continued to improve, the swelling almost completely gone, though a vivid scar would forever mark the site of the snake's bite. By the time the outskirts of Tuxen came into view, she could walk short distances with only a slight limp. Griffin had arranged ahead of time, through a passing traveler they'd encountered, for both his horses and Bethany's cattle to be received at the stockyard. The cattle buyer was waiting when they arrived, his eyebrows rising in surprise when he saw Bethany. "Miss Evans," he greeted her, helping her down from the wagon. "Your father always spoke highly of you, but he never mentioned you'd be taking over his business dealings." "Life has a way of surprising us, Mr. Hollister," Bethany replied, standing as straight as her healing leg would allow. "I trust we can come to a fair arrangement for these cattle." The older man glanced at Griffin, who stood protectively close to Bethany. "And you are?" "Griffin Quinn," he answered, extending his hand. "I'm with Miss Evans." The simple statement, and the way he positioned himself slightly behind her rather than taking over the negotiation, told Bethany more about his character than 1,000 declarations could have. He respected her ability to handle her own business, even as he stood ready to support her if needed. Mr. Hollister proved fair in his dealings, offering a price for the cattle that exceeded Bethany's expectations. It would be enough to pay the bank and have a small amount left over to reinvest in the ranch. As they left the stockyard, Griffin with a pocket full of cash from his own horse sale, Bethany felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "We did it," she said, unable to keep the smile from her face. Griffin nodded, his own expression lightening. "You did it," he corrected. "I just provided the transportation." "You provided much more than that," Bethany said softly, reaching for his hand. They secured rooms at a modest hotel, separate rooms, as propriety demanded, though both were acutely aware of the thin wall that separated them. After cleaning up from their journey, they met for dinner in the hotel's small dining room. Dressed in a simple blue dress she'd packed for her arrival in town, her hair freshly washed and arranged in loose waves around her shoulders, Bethany looked transformed from the trail-worn rancher of the past 2 weeks. Griffin, too, had cleaned up well, his dark hair slicked back, his shirt fresh and his face cleanly shaven. "You look beautiful," he said as she joined him at the table. Bethany blushed, still unaccustomed to such direct compliments. "Thank you. You clean up rather nicely yourself." Their dinner conversation flowed easily, both carefully avoiding discussion of what would happen next. It wasn't until they were finishing their coffee that Griffin broached the subject. "When do you plan to head back to Quartzsite?" he asked, turning his cup slowly in his hands. "Day after tomorrow," Bethany replied. "I need to settle with the bank tomorrow and then purchase supplies before the journey home." Griffin nodded, his expression thoughtful. "My business here is concluded as well." Bethany waited, her heart in her throat. Would he offer to accompany her home? Or would this be where they parted ways? "Bethany," Griffin began, setting his cup aside and leaning forward. "These past 2 weeks have been the most meaningful of my life. I know it's fast, perhaps too fast for conventional thinking, but I've never been one for conventions." She smiled at that, remembering his stories of bucking tradition and forging his own path. "What I'm trying to say," he continued, "is that I'd like to come back to Quartzsite with you, not just to see you safely home, but to court you properly, if you'll allow it." Relief and joy flooded through Bethany. "I'd like that very much," she said, reaching across the table to take his hand. Griffin's smile was radiant. "Good," he said simply, squeezing her fingers, "because I think I'm falling in love with you, Bethany Evans." The bold declaration might have shocked her 2 weeks ago, but now it only confirmed what her heart already knew. "I think I'm falling in love with you too, Griffin Quinn." The next day was a flurry of activity. Bethany met with the bank representative, paying off her father's loan in full and establishing herself as a businesswoman in her own right. Griffin secured a sturdy wagon and supplies for their return journey, insisting on paying for half, despite Bethany's protests. "Consider it an investment in our future," he said with a wink that made her heart skip a beat. By the time they left Tuxen 2 days later, word had spread about the female rancher who had driven her own cattle to market despite a rattlesnake bite. Several local businessmen made a point of introducing themselves to Bethany, expressing interest in future dealings with the Double E Ranch. The return journey to Quartzsite was far more pleasant than their trip to Tuxen. With Bethany's leg healing well, they traveled at an easy pace, taking time to enjoy each other's company without the pressure of a deadline hanging over them. They talked of the future Griffin's plans to sell his property near Prescott and invest in expanding the Double E, Bethany's ideas for diversifying the ranch's operations. In the evenings, they allowed themselves the luxury of growing closer, their kisses becoming more passionate as their connection deepened. Griffin remained the gentleman, always pulling back before things went too far, though the desire in his eyes told Bethany he struggled with his restraint. "I want to do this right," he explained one night as they sat beside their campfire, his arm around her shoulders. "You deserve a proper courtship, not a rushed affair on the trail." Bethany appreciated his respect for her honor, even as part of her wished he would be less considerate of propriety. As they neared Quartzsite, Anticipation built in Bethany's chest. She was eager to show Griffin the double E, to see her home through his eyes and imagine the life they might build there together. The ranch came into view late one afternoon, the main house nestled against a backdrop of rugged hills, the corral and barn standing empty but sturdy. It wasn't grand, a simple two-story structure with a wide front porch and shuttered windows, but it was home. "It's beautiful," Griffin said as they pulled the wagon into the yard. "I can see why you fought so hard to keep it." Bethany felt tears prick her eyes. "It needs work," she admitted. "The south fence is down in places and the barn roof leaks when it rains." "Nothing we can't fix," Griffin said, the casual we making her heart swell. That evening, after settling the horses and bringing in their supplies, they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Bethany had prepared a simple meal, and they ate in comfortable silence, occasionally exchanging glances that spoke volumes. "What are you thinking?" Bethany finally asked as darkness fell around them. Griffin set his plate aside and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I'm thinking that I don't want to wait any longer to ask you something important." Bethany's breath caught as he slid from his chair to one knee before her. "Bethany Evans, I know this is fast. I know that by all conventional wisdom we should court for months or even years before taking such a step. But nothing about our meeting or our time together has been conventional." He smiled up at her, his eyes shining in the lantern light. "I love you. I knew it that night in the storm, and every day since has only confirmed it. Will you marry me? Will you let me help you build your father's legacy into something that would make him proud?" Tears spilled down Bethany's cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Finally, she managed, "Yes, Griffin, yes, I'll marry you." He surged to his feet, pulling her up with him and into a kiss that sealed their promise to each other. When they broke apart, both breathing heavily, Griffin pressed his forehead to hers. "I don't have a ring yet," he apologized. "But I promise to get you one in town tomorrow." Bethany shook her head. "I don't need a ring. I just need you." Their wedding took place 3 weeks later in the small church in Quartzsite. The entire town turned out for the event, curious about the handsome stranger who had won the heart of Jacob Evans's daughter so quickly. Bethany wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her taller frame. Griffin, dressed in a new suit purchased for the occasion, watched her walk down the aisle with an expression of such adoration that several of the older women in attendance were seen dabbing at their eyes. The couple exchanged simple vows, promising to love and support each other through all the challenges life might bring. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Griffin's kiss was both tender and possessive, a public declaration of his commitment to the woman who had changed his life. The reception was held at the Double E, the ranch yard transformed with lanterns and tables borrowed from neighbors. As the celebration continued around them, Griffin led Bethany away from the crowds to a quiet spot near the corral. "Happy, Mrs. Quinn?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. Bethany leaned back against his chest, watching their guests laughing and dancing in the yard. "More than I ever thought possible," she admitted. "Are you having second thoughts about settling down?" Griffin's arms tightened around her. "Not a single one," he assured her. "This is where I belong. With you." As they rejoined their guests, Bethany caught sight of her wedding gift to Griffin, the deed to the ranch, redrawn to include his name alongside hers. It was more than a piece of paper. It was a symbol of their partnership, their shared future, and the legacy they would build together. In the years that followed, the Double E flourished under their joint care. Griffin's expertise with horses complemented Bethany's knowledge of cattle ranching, and together they expanded the operation beyond what Jacob Evans had ever envisioned. A year after their wedding, Bethany gave birth to their first child, a son they named Jacob Griffin Quinn, in honor of both her father and the man who had saved her life in more ways than one. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, followed by another son 3 years after that. The snake bite scar on Bethany's leg faded with time, but never disappeared completely. She considered it a reminder of the day that had changed her life, the day a rattler's strike had led her to the love of her life. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Griffin surprised Bethany with a special gift, a small silver pendant shaped like a snake, crafted by a silversmith in Tuxen. "To remember how we found each other," he explained as he fastened it around her neck. Bethany touched the pendant, smiling at the symbolism. "As if I could ever forget." That night, as their children slept soundly in their beds, Bethany and Griffin stood on the porch of the ranch house, arms around each other as they gazed up at the star-filled desert sky. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come along when that snake bit me?" Bethany asked softly. Griffin shook his head. "I believe we were meant to find each other one way or another, if not that day, then another." "Such faith," she teased, though she had come to share his belief in their destined meeting. "Faith in us," he corrected, turning her to face him. 5 years, 3 children, and a thriving ranch later, I'd say that faith has been well placed. Bethany rose on tiptoe to kiss him, still marveling at how this man, once a stranger who had saved her from a rattlesnake's venom, had become the center of her world. "I love you, Griffin Quinn." "And I love you, Bethany Quinn," he replied, the name still bringing a smile to both their faces even after 5 years. "Until my dying day and beyond." As they stood together under the vast Arizona sky, the ranch spread out around them and their children sleeping safely inside, both knew that what had started as a chance encounter on a desert trail had grown into something far more precious than either could have imagined, a love strong enough to withstand any trial, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared dreams, and a family legacy that would endure for generations to come. The rattlesnake that had brought them together had intended death, but instead had given them life together. And neither would change a single moment of their journey, not even the painful bite that had started it all.